Welcome to the 1 Hour Guide by Neil Nafu. Today, we're diving deep into David Spiegelhalter's The Art of Uncertainty, How to Navigate Chance, Ignorance, Risk, and Luck, which is the 1 Hour Guide our listener shared with us. And our goal is to extract the core lessons from this to help you navigate the unpredictable aspects of business and life more effectively.
Yeah, this is a great book for anyone who wants to understand how uncertainty shapes their lives and businesses. He has this amazing ability to break down complex statistical ideas and make them accessible, and more importantly, applicable.
Yeah, absolutely. And this 1 Hour Guide by Neil Nafu will focus on Spiegelhalter's insights into how we perceive and interact with chance, risk, and randomness, and how these insights can empower us to navigate the unpredictable with greater clarity and confidence. So let's start with a fundamental concept, how personal uncertainty really is.
What's fascinating about this is Spiegelhalter's idea that uncertainty isn't this objective truth. It's a relationship between you and the uncertain event. Your current knowledge and emotional state, these really influence how you experience uncertainty.
That makes so much sense. I guess about the odds is how those odds land with you. And he makes a really helpful distinction.
He does. He distinguishes between aleatory uncertainty, which is the inherent randomness that we see in a coin toss, for instance, and epistemic uncertainty, which comes from our lack of knowledge. And recognizing what type of uncertainty you're facing has huge implications.
Right. If it's epistemic uncertainty, you gather more information. You learn your way out of the uncertainty.
Yeah.
But if it's aleatory uncertainty, you need strategies for managing that unpredictability. So for our listener, this means that the first step in making decisions under uncertainty isn't just about the numbers. It's about understanding your own perspective and biases.
Precisely. You know, we all have our own risk tolerances. We all have past experiences that shape how we interpret uncertainty. And Spiegelhalter offers some practical steps to managing this personal aspect.
He does. He says, we should be identifying the nature of the uncertainty, acknowledging our own biases. Are we naturally optimistic or pessimistic? Assessing the specific context, and he also recommends trying to quantify your confidence with probabilities, even if it feels a little bit uncomfortable at first.
Yeah, quantifying it is a big step. And that pushes us beyond those vague feelings and towards a more analytical assessment. And Spiegelhalter also points out that we need to distinguish between genuine risk and fear-driven anxieties.
Absolutely. And then he also says, we should be developing concrete management strategies.
Yeah.
And recognizing that sometimes uncertainty can actually lead to some positive outcome.
And opportunities.
Absolutely. The path less traveled can lead to some interesting places.
It definitely can. Now let's move on to how we can put numbers on this fuzziness. So building on the personal nature of uncertainty, Spiegelhalter goes on to talk about quantifying uncertainty with probability. And he says that using vague language just isn't good enough when we're making important decisions.
He's quite blunt about this. And he points out that vague terms lead to misinterpretations and sometimes really bad decisions. And he uses the Bay of Pigs invasion as an example.
Where the phrase fair chance was interpreted in wildly different ways by different people.
Yeah, that's a chilling example, and it underscores the dangers of ambiguity when there are high stakes involved.
It does. And the key takeaway is that moving from this vague language to probabilities, even if those probabilities are imperfect, it really improves clarity and it reduces the risk of miscommunication. And this is a lesson that every leadership team should take from the Bay of Pigs example.
Absolutely. So how do we do this? How do we quantify uncertainty?
Well, Spiegelhalter says we need to recognize that uncertainty exists on a spectrum from almost certain to highly improbable. He advocates using past data whenever we can, but also being mindful of how subjective estimates about the future can be.
And it's worth remembering that even past data is not always a perfect predictor. We have black swan events, which remind us that we can't rely solely on historical information.
Right. Things can happen that we never predicted.
They do. So he talks about translating those vague words into numerical probabilities, and he references the IPCC's work, where they've defined terms like likely or very likely with specific percentage ranges.
That's a great example of putting numbers on those vague feelings.
It is. And he also talks about using confidence levels to express how sure you are about your estimates. And he even suggests doing some exercises for testing and improving your own probability assessment skills.
Which is a fantastic way to calibrate your intuition, and by actively testing yourself, you're going to become more aware of your own tendencies to overestimate or underestimate risk.
Absolutely. Ultimately, Spiegelhalter argues that this act of quantifying uncertainty through probability transforms it from this amorphous fear into a tool that leaders and entrepreneurs can use to assess risk and communicate more effectively.
Turning it from a feeling into something concrete.
Exactly. Now, how does this help us with the randomness we see in the world?
So once we start thinking in terms of probabilities, Spiegelhalter delves into taming chance with probability. And this is where we see how the principles of probability can help us make sense of seemingly random events.
It's amazing to remember that probability theory really grew out of trying to understand games of chance.
Yeah.
And now it's this fundamental element in fields like finance and medicine.
Yeah, it gives us a framework for understanding how random processes behave.
Yeah.
And for making predictions, not about individual events, but about patterns over the long run.
Absolutely. So how do we tame chance?
Well, Spiegelhalter highlights the importance of recognizing patterns in large numbers, the law of large numbers. For example, when we flip a coin once, the result is unpredictable. But if we flip a coin thousands of times, the number of heads and tails is probably going to be about even. So he also covers how to calculate probabilities using ratios and the difference between independent events, like those coin flips, and dependent events, like drawing cards from a deck, without replacing them.
Yeah, and that distinction is critical for accurate risk assessment.
It is, because if you misunderstand that, you can make really flawed assumptions about the likelihood of events occurring together.
You can. So he introduces the concept of expected value, which is a tool for evaluating potential outcomes. And he underscores the role of probability in making informed decisions. But importantly, he also cautions against common probability mistakes, like the gambler's fallacy.
Oh, the gambler's fallacy. Yeah, that's the mistaken belief that past random outcomes can influence future independent events. So if you flipped a coin and got heads 10 times in a row, you might think the tails is due. But the odds of getting tails on the next flip are still 50-50.
Yeah, and the gambler's fallacy really highlights our tendency to look for patterns where there aren't any.
Right. It's a reminder that each random event is its own independent thing.
Absolutely. And then finally, Spiegelhalter emphasizes that by understanding and applying probability, we can work to reduce risk and develop more robust strategies, which gives us an edge in a world filled with uncertainty.
Absolutely. Turning that randomness into something we can manage.
Now, what about those events that seem so unlikely, that they feel significant?
Yeah, this one we get to Spiegelhalter's discussion of surprises and coincidences, those events that make you go, wow, what are the odds?
Right, that feeling when something just too weird happens.
Our brains are wired to look for patterns, so we give these seemingly improbable events special meaning.
We do. And he explains that in a world with billions of interactions happening all the time, many unlikely events are actually quite probable. You know, think about the birthday paradox.
Yeah, that's a classic example. So in a relatively small group, the chances of two people sharing the same birthday are surprisingly high. And that's because the number of possible pairings increases rapidly as the group size grows.
Right. So it's not really magic, it's just math. The sheer volume of events that are happening in the world mean that even low probability events are going to happen to someone, somewhere, eventually.
Yeah, and this is where the law of truly large numbers comes into play. You know, when you're dealing with billions of events, those rare events become less surprising.
Absolutely. So understanding coincidence involves acknowledging that. With large numbers, rare events become less surprising. And Spiegelhalter stresses the importance of actually calculating probabilities.
Right.
Rather than relying on our intuition.
Right. Don't just go with your gut. Actually crunch the numbers.
He also points to the role of selective memory. We tend to remember the unusual coincidences and forget all the mundane events.
We focus on the things that stand out.
We do, and for leaders. It's crucial to distinguish between correlation and causation when you're dealing with these seemingly surprising trends.
Yes, just because two things happen together doesn't mean that one caused the other.
It doesn't. So Spiegelhalter emphasizes that many coincidences don't require this extraordinary explanation. Probability alone can often account for them.
It's often simpler than we think.
It is. And he says we should be using probability to manage our expectations and to avoid being unduly swayed by events that, while surprising, are not statistically improbable.
Right. Keep that broader perspective in mind.
Yeah, let's talk about something even more intangible. Luck.
So now Spiegelhalter delves into this often discussed but rarely analyzed concept of luck. And he tries to categorize it in a useful way, looking at how it interacts with probability and our perceptions of success and failure.
All right, is luck just random chance, or are there different types of luck?
So he breaks it down into random luck, which is pure chance, constitutive luck, which are the circumstances you were born into, circumstantial luck, which are the external events that affect your opportunities, and discovered luck, which is where you actively create situations where good things are more likely to happen.
Yeah, and that's a really useful framework for understanding the different ways that luck can play out in our lives.
It is, and the extent to which we might be able to influence it.
So how do we manage luck?
Well, it starts by recognizing how pervasive it is. Luck is everywhere. And then Spiegelhalter says it's important to distinguish between skill and luck. So sustained success is usually a sign of underlying skill. And we can use probability to assess the role of luck in various outcomes, which encourages a more objective self-assessment.
Yeah, and prevents us from attributing everything to either our own genius or sheer misfortune.
Exactly. It helps us see things more clearly. And that idea of increasing discovered luck by doing things like networking and continuous learning is something that resonates with me, because it means we can take some control.
Absolutely. Yeah. And then he cautions against the illusion of control over purely random events. And he says we should be prepared for bad luck and adopt this growth mindset towards luck, where we see both good and bad fortune as potential learning experiences.
Yeah, viewing those setbacks as opportunities for growth.
Now let's consider the role of pure randomness itself.
So Spiegelhalter emphasizes that randomness plays a bigger role in our lives and major outcomes than we think. We tend to look for order and meaning, but sometimes things just happen without a discernible cause.
They do. And managing randomness involves acknowledging that. It's a natural part of life. He warns against apophenia.
Apophenia, right. That's seeing patterns in random data where there are none.
And he reiterates the use of probability, particularly the law of large numbers, to understand random events. And he points out how small random differences can sometimes lead to dramatically different outcomes. The butterfly effect.
The butterfly effect, yeah. A small change in one place can have huge effects elsewhere.
Yeah, and the butterfly effect is a reminder of the interconnectedness. Yeah. And the unpredictability of complex systems.
It is, and that we can't always control everything.
We can't. And then he cautions against the illusion of predictability, the belief that we can always foresee what's coming. And he also points out that random processes aren't inherently fair. And he advises us to prepare for randomness rather than resisting it.
Right, embracing the unknown.
Now that we've explored all these facets of uncertainty, how can we use this to guide our beliefs and actions?
This is where we get to the really exciting part, the idea of being Bayesian. So Bayesian thinking is a way of thinking about how we update our beliefs in light of new evidence.
Yeah, and Bayesian thinking is about starting with an initial belief, a prior, and then revising that belief based on the strength and reliability of new information to arrive at a posterior belief.
And it's this continuous process of learning and refinement, recognizing that our understanding is always evolving as we get new data.
So it's a constant process of learning and refinement and recognizing that our knowledge is never really complete.
Yeah. There's always more to learn.
There is. And so applying Bayesian thinking involves starting with our current understanding, actively seeking out new evidence, evaluating its trustworthiness, and adjusting our beliefs accordingly.
It's this constant feedback loop of updating our beliefs.
And the strength of the evidence will dictate how much we should revise our beliefs.
It does. If the evidence is really strong, we might make big changes to our beliefs, but if it's weak, we might only make small adjustments.
And then he also cautions against overconfidence, the tendency to cling to our initial beliefs, even when they're contradicted by evidence.
Yeah, we all have that tendency to stick to what we know.
We do. And so he encourages us to be open to new information and to be willing to change our mind
when the evidence demands it.
And he acknowledges the subjective element of our initial prior beliefs. But he emphasizes that if we consistently apply these Bayesian principles, it can lead to more objective and accurate understandings over time.
So Bayesian thinking, it's a powerful tool that we can use in many areas of life, from science to business to our personal lives.
It is now, it's considered the role of science in navigating uncertainty.
So Spiegelhalter makes this great point that uncertainty is not a flaw in science. It's central to the scientific process. Science progresses by acknowledging and investigating uncertainty through rigorous testing and data analysis.
Right. So science isn't about achieving absolute certainty. It's about refining our understanding
based on the evidence and acknowledging that there are limitations to our knowledge.
So he talks about the different types of uncertainty that exist in science. Measurement error, statistical variability, limitations of our models.
Right, and recognizing these different sources of uncertainty is essential. When we're interpreting scientific findings, it prevents us from overstating the certainty of our claims.
Absolutely. So he highlights how we can use probability to express confidence levels in scientific conclusions, and he emphasizes the role of peer review and replication in validating findings and reducing uncertainty. And then he warns against the misinterpretation of scientific uncertainty, particularly in the public discourse, where uncertainty can be used to justify inaction.
Just because there's uncertainty doesn't mean that we shouldn't act.
It doesn't. And then he also advocates for applying the principles of scientific thinking to our everyday lives, maintaining a healthy skepticism, but also relying on evidence to make decisions.
Right, finding that balance.
Now, when we conduct an analysis, how much confidence can we really have in our conclusions?
So this is a key question, and Spiegelhalter discusses it in his section on confidence in analysis, and he stresses that no analysis is perfect. We need to understand the degree of uncertainty in our conclusions if we want to make good decisions.
Right, we need to be aware of the limitations of our data and our methods.
Absolutely, and one key tool for doing that is using confidence intervals, which give us a range within which the true value is likely to fall.
Yeah, and confidence intervals give us a much more realistic picture than a single point estimate.
It gives us a sense of that margin of error in our analysis.
Absolutely, and he also emphasizes considering the strength of the evidence and the size of the sample. More data usually leads to more confidence.
That's a general rule of thumb, and we can use probability distributions to illustrate the range of possible outcomes.
We can, and then crucially, Spiegelhalter says we should be expressing our confidence levels clearly and avoiding overconfidence and overprecision, not presenting our findings with a false sense of absolute certainty.
Right, be honest about those limitations.
Be honest, and then he makes this really interesting point that communicating uncertainty actually builds trust.
It does. People are more likely to believe you if you acknowledge the limitations of your knowledge.
Absolutely. Now let's move on to figuring out what causes what.
So now Spiegelhalter addresses this challenge of determining causality. And our intuition often leads us to assume causal links where only correlations exist, which can lead to some bad decisions.
It can, just because two things happen together. It doesn't mean that one caused the other.
It doesn't. You've heard that before. Correlation doesn't equal causation.
And establishing causality usually requires more rigorous methods, like controlled experiments, where you isolate the effect of one variable.
Right, and controlled experiments, they're the gold standard for establishing causal relationships.
Absolutely. And he also talks about analyzing the strength and consistency of a relationship, considering the time order of events.
So the cause has to come before the effect. And accounting for confounding variables, those hidden factors, that could be influencing both of the variables you're looking at.
And looking for dose-response relationships, where a bigger dose of the potential cause leads to a bigger effect.
Right. That can provide more evidence for causality.
It can. And then he touches on using sophisticated causal models to help disentangle complex relationships. Using examples from climate science and business.
Yeah. It's amazing how much we can learn about causality, even in complex systems.
Now, shifting our focus forward, how do we approach predicting the future, given all this uncertainty?
So Spiegelhalter is really clear about this. Predictions should be seen as probabilistic. They offer a range of outcomes, not definitive statements about what will happen.
Right. No one has a crystal ball. And making and evaluating predictions involves defining what we're trying to predict, gathering data, and using probability models to account for the uncertainty.
And it's crucial to acknowledge and communicate that uncertainty. Our predictions should come with a sense of how likely different scenarios are to play out.
Absolutely. And he talks about accounting for various uncertainty factors and distinguishing between short-term predictions, which tend to be more reliable,
and long-term forecasts, which are more uncertain.
And he cautions against overfitting our models to past data